Hi all, thank you for joining us. My name is Ariella Novak. I'm the director of a department called the Jewish Community Relations Committee for the Jewish Federation of Northern New Jersey. Thank you for joining us today. Normally we hold different programmings having to do with iCAN, which teaches students, high school students, grades 9 through 12, how to combat anti-Semitism, understand what BDS is, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and how to succeed in a world that is not necessarily voting in a Jewish way, that's not necessarily protecting Israel, that doesn't always have your best interests. So we are here to help as a federation, and this program is normally, like I said, geared towards high school students. But today we are opening it up to both the community and to the high school students as well. So I would like to introduce the chair of the iCAN department. Her name is Donna Weintraub. Donna, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you, Ariella. I'm not sure, for those of you who don't know me, I'm a member of the Board of Trustees of Federation, and as Ariella said, the chair of the iCAN program. I'm not sure if you saw in the news this past Tuesday, but the exterior of the UMass Amherst Hillel was defaced with spray paint on Yom HaShoah. And if you've seen the images of the anti-Jewish signs that are being held in rallies across this country, where people are petitioning their governments, our government, to reopen the state, those images were shocking to me. Pictures of rats wearing Jewish stars with the slogan, "The Real Plague." I was shocked until a friend reminded me that anti-Semitism doesn't rest, so neither can we. So I want to thank you for joining us for this very important live webinar with Miri Kornfeld, the Executive Director of High School Affairs for Stand With Us. But before I introduce Miri, I wanted to take a moment to tell you about the work of Federation. Since the beginning of COVID, when COVID entered our lives, Federation has been working very hard to keep our community connected during this very disconnected time. At Federation's core mission, it's to keep our community strong, help vulnerable populations, and build Jewish identity. In the past month or so, since we've been safe at home, Federation has been on the top of our community's emerging needs, providing funds for economic relief, food for seniors, and even PPE supplies for our partnering organizations and agencies. Federation has purchased and supplied over 4,000 masks for our senior facilities, raised over $300,000 for relief from coronavirus issues, and right before Passover, we allocated over $200,000 to partnering agencies. The COVID crisis has created an unprecedented challenge, and we all need an unprecedented response. Federation is there to care for our vulnerable populations every day, especially in times of crisis, which requires a whole new level. Now let me introduce you to Miri. Miri was originally from Denver, Colorado, and found her passion for promoting Israel as a student at UCLA. Upon graduating, she joined the Stand With Us team and is today the Executive Director of High School Affairs in North America. Miri focuses on promoting education about Israel to high school students, providing them with the support and tools that they need to become leaders and Israel advocates on their future college campus and in their communities. Today, Miri is going to share with us some tips and techniques on how we can continue to advocate, even from our socially distant space, on issues that are important to us even now. Miri, welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me. I want to add, in addition to everything wonderful that was already said, that we are going to be accepting questions as part of this webinar. So if you could go ahead, as we go through the program, if you could go ahead and type your questions into the chat box or into the Q&A section. Those questions will be moderated, and we will get to them at the end of the program, but there is going to be a chance for you guys to participate in the program as we move forward. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen with you so that we can go ahead and get started. I am going to assume that you can all see my PowerPoint at this point. So we are going to be talking a little bit today about online activism. I am sure that we are all feeling a little bit distanced because we have to socially distance, and that does not stop advocating for Israel, that doesn't stop standing up for Israel, and that doesn't stop learning about Israel. And so I'm going to share with you a little bit about how you can continue to do so. And what Stand With Us is doing in order to empower high school students, and how you take advantage of those resources in order to become empowered yourselves. Now, just a brief background, Stand With Us is an international Israel education organization. Our goal is to work with communities around the world in order to make sure that they have the tools that they need in order to have effective conversations about Israel, in order to educate about Israel, and if need be, in order to stand up for Israel. I specifically am the executive director of our high school department, which started about 9 years ago when we noticed that high school students were getting to college campuses ill-prepared for what they might face with regards to the Israel activity. And so we started teaching high school students at an earlier age so that by the time they got to their college campuses, they'd be able to be leaders for Israel the second that they got started. Personally, that's something that I wish had existed when I was a high school student. Just briefly about me and what got me to where I am today. I am a graduate of UCLA. I grew up in a Jewish community in Denver, Colorado. So yes, there are Jews in Denver. The way that I describe the Jewish community in Denver is that it is large enough that you don't have to know everybody, but it's small enough that you can, and my mother does. She taught at the Jewish day school, and I was very excited when I got accepted to UCLA as my undergraduate. In order to pursue an undergraduate degree, because I was excited to be part of a larger Jewish community with larger Jewish activities. Much like UMass Amherst was just defaced with the Hillel was defaced on Yom HaShoah. I will never forget my first experience with anti-Israel activity at UCLA, which also was on Yom HaShoah, when I saw the beginning of what I learned was Apartheid Week at UCLA, with a huge apartheid wall at the center of my campus. I had no idea what to do, so I cried, and I sought out the pro-Israel group at UCLA called Bruins for Israel, and became very active in that organization. And in my senior year, I became the president of Bruins for Israel, because my goal, even though I wasn't a biochemistry major at UCLA, which naturally leads to a career in Israel education, I decided that any sort of pro-Israel or Jewish activity was ultimately going to be more important than anything that I could do in the sciences at UCLA. And when I graduated, I swore that no high school student was ever going to have a deer in the headlights moment, just like I did when I was a high school student. And that's why I joined Stand With Us and started our high school department. And here we are today, reaching over 90,000 high school students around North America. And I'm really excited to share with you today some of the techniques that we teach them that you can take advantage of as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Online activism. So the important thing for you to keep in mind is that conversations are very important. We don't want you to come away from this program having learned that you shouldn't be having conversations, even if it means having a conversation with someone that you don't necessarily agree with. You should absolutely be having conversations with people that you don't necessarily agree with, and you should be having conversations with people that you do agree with. Educated discussions about Israel are what is going to help Israel move forward. It's going to help you advance in your Israel knowledge. Those types of discussions are healthy, and we want you to be having those discussions. What we want to urge you to do is to know when to call out anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism when you do see that, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And the most important thing is, don't go looking for a fight. Don't assume that the boogeyman is behind every single door coming out to get you. When you are going on in your daily life, don't go looking for a fight. Chances are you are not going to find one. If you do, you can use some of these resources that we're going to go through with you today, but don't assume that it's everywhere. Always assume intent before you are going to be talking about how to respond to it. So before we kind of move into learning how to respond to different allegations that we hear about Israel, or what to even do, how to process what we see on social media and on the internet, especially in the age of social distancing, we want to know how to recognize it, right? It's one thing to respond to anti-Israel or anti-Semitic claims, but it's another thing to realize what you're actually seeing. And it's very simple. It comes down to this very easy formula called the 3 Ds. It was originally coined by Natan Sharansky, for those of you who don't know, he's the former chair of the Jewish Agency in Israel, in addition to a Soviet refugee who was jailed for trying to save Jews in Soviet Russia before a bunch of those Jews actually made Aliyah to Israel. And so this is a technique that he coined in order to realize when you are seeing something that is anti-Israel, when does it cross the line into anti-Semitism? And it's when it fits into one of these three categories called the 3Ds. Does it demonize Israel or the Jewish people? Is it a delegitimization of Israel or the Jewish people? Or is it holding Israel to a double standard that isn't expected of any other country around the world? And we're going to jump into a couple of examples of what that means so you have a better idea. So the first thing is demonization. If you hear a claim that describes Jews or Israelis as the enemy, as evil, as dangerous, as monstrous, as something subhuman that you wouldn't consider the normal human face that you see, that is an example of demonization. This includes issues of blood libel. That's something that I saw on my college campus when I was a student. Specific Jewish stereotypes, especially when we're talking about in the Holocaust, right? When you see the Jewish stereotype with the big nose, the large ears, the money, things like that. That is when it would cross the line into anti-Semitism, when it is referring to Israel as any of those things. And then, of course, using examples of Nazis, demons, vampires, again, anything subhuman. And what's the reason for demonizing? In addition to being able to recognize it, the reason for demonizing Israel is because when you demonize something and you consider it to be subhuman, it isolates that thing. And when you isolate something, it's a lot easier to eliminate it. So it's really a mind game that Israel's detractors are playing in order to help move away from that, from seeing Israel as a legitimate cause. Something that we are seeing today, this is something that I took from the news. This is from March 7th. We are seeing a demonization of Israel when it comes to coronavirus. So this is something that Press TV put out on March 7th. You can watch the whole clip if you'd like to. I provided the link at the bottom of this program, but something that I really wanted to hone into is a specific quote that says, now they are trying to amplify the plague of coronavirus in Iran, they, meaning Israel, the plague of coronavirus in Iran, which one suspects that they themselves had actually engineered, because otherwise, how could an Israeli company claim that they have a vaccine against coronavirus in less than 2 weeks, when all scientists say that if there is a novel outbreak like this, it would take at least a year to have a vaccine? So this is an example of demonization, right? They're saying that Israel actually created the coronavirus and then spread it all around the world. That is demonizing the state of Israel. This, according to the 3Ds, this formula of the 3Ds coined by Natan Sharansky, and by the way, I forgot to mention, is actually used by the State Department to help determine what is anti-Semitic in the United States. This would be an example of when hate speech has crossed the line from legitimate criticism of Israel. This is not legitimate criticism of Israel. It has crossed the line into anti-Semitism, and this is something that can be called out as anti-Semitic. So that's an example of demonization. The second example of the 3Ds is delegitimization. This is when we are denying Israel's right to exist or denying Israel's right to defend itself. When it claims that the Jewish people, unlike all other ethnic groups, national groups, have no claim to sovereignty. The Jewish people have no claim to a land, even though other people might have claim to a land. And then, of course, claiming that Zionism is racism, which is something that we see all too often. If you look at the picture on the right-hand side of the screen, we see from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. The river, of course, that they are referring to is the Jordan River. The sea that they are referring to is the Mediterranean. The Jordan River to the Mediterranean, from the river to the sea, that is all of Israel. There's no room for Israel in any of that map. That is an example of delegitimization, saying that Israel does not have a right to exist. So that's an example of delegitimization. And then here's a couple of examples that I just took from recently. The example that you'll see on the left is something that I took from Instagram a couple of years ago. And sorry, not a couple of years ago, a couple of days ago, where we see that they are comparing different issues that happened around the world to Israel, and then saying whether or not Israel legitimately has a right to exist. On the bottom it says, now they say Israel is legal, Legality is a matter of power, not justice. So this is inferring free_Palestine.23 on Instagram is inferring that Israel does not have a right to exist. This is an example of delegitimization, and therefore it is an example of anti-Semitism and can be called out as such. Here's the article on the left. Is something that is part of the global research. It's an article written by Norman Finkelstein, and you can see parts of it say that the use of excessive and disproportionate and indiscriminate force by the Israeli forces against Palestinian civilians. We know that one of the things that the IDF praises itself on is that there is not indiscriminate, that they are targeting the different attacks that they make against Hamas in Gaza. This is referring to Hamas in Gaza. And then the second sentence says, Israeli forces repeatedly use lethal force in the Gaza Strip against demonstrators who pose no imminent threat to life and may amount to war crimes. We of course know that this might be talking about the riots that are happening on Gaza's border, where people are trying to infiltrate into Israel from Gaza. That is a imminent threat to life, and that is not something that was shown in the rest of the news. So this, again, would be an example of delegitimization, because this is saying that Israel has no right to defend itself. That is an example of delegitimization. Therefore, it is an example of anti-Semitism and can be called out as such. So the first one, I'm just going to recap, is demonization. The second one is delegitimization. And the last one is double standards. This one is probably one of the easiest ones to be able to call out. It's when Israel is held to a standard that's not expected of any other country in the world. The most prominent example is looking at the United Nations, when the UN disproportionately condemns Israel, when academic institutions boycott Israel but no one else, and then of course condemning Israel for acts of self-defense that are accepted by other countries. When another country is attacked, of course they're going to retaliate because it is their duty to protect their citizens. You can see that this is an example that I took from the United Nations. This is from November of 2019, a General Assembly Committee today, so that was on November 19th, adopted 8 resolutions that single out or condemn Israel and 0 against the rest of the world. This, of course, is from Human Rights Watch, which looks in, I'm sorry, UN Watch, not Human Rights Watch. This is from UN Watch, in order to keep an eye on the United Nations to see when they are holding Israel to a double standard. This, of course, is one of the easiest ways to make sure that we are calling out anti-Semitism, which happens every day at the United Nations. So those are the 3 Ds. Again, demonization, delegitimization, and double standards. Anytime you see a claim against Israel on social media or otherwise when you're having conversations with people that falls into any of these 3 categories, these can be called out as anti-Semitic, and they should be called out as anti-Semitic in order to make sure that people understand really what they are saying and how they can become better. You always have to assume intent. Sometimes people are just saying it because they don't know any better. They were not educated about the matter. But if you do see matters where malice was involved, where they are truly trying to demonize the state of Israel, that's when we really need to make sure that it's being called out as anti-Semitic. So I would like to take a quick break from content, and I want to actually open it up to the audience. I want you all to take out your phones and to open up Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, whatever, any news source that you commonly use. And I want you to take a look and see if you can notice any examples of any of these 3 Ds, demonization, delegitimization, or double standard. And I want us to share some of those examples here. If you want to share any of those examples, you can go ahead and raise your hand, and one of the moderators will unmute you. And then we together as a webinar will decide whether or not it fits into one of the 3 Ds, or if it is in fact legitimate criticism of Israel, which by the way exists. Just like the United States, Israel is a normal country, which means that it is not perfect, and therefore you can criticize it if you are criticizing a policy. If you are criticizing its right to exist, that is another, that's another story. So what we are going to do is I'm going to ask everybody, to go ahead and pull out their phones. If you want to search certain hashtags, that might work. If you would like to search just on your normal Facebook news feed. If you have any examples that you would like to share, you can ask, you can post in the chat box, and I will give us a 5-minute break right now, or not a 5-minute break, a 2-minute break to go ahead and look at those different examples, and then we'll come back together to debrief them. All right, so just to remind everybody, those 3 Ds are demonization, delegitimization, and double standards. So if you see any examples of anti-Israel activity in any of your social media feeds that fits into any one of these 3 Ds, you can call it out as anti-Semitic, and in fact, you should call it out as anti-Semitic. We need to be able to be correcting misinformation that we see about Israel on social media, especially while we're socially distancing, and we can't have in-person conversations with our friends. So we are going to move forward and take one step further. So now that we know how to recognize how to, when anti-Israel activity crosses the line into anti-Semitism, and that we should call it out, what do we say? What is the next step? So how do we respond? This is another key tool that we teach our students, both in high school and on college campuses all around North America, in order to respond effectively to those different claims. And it's very simple. Again, it's another formula. We're all about formulas here. So this formula, instead of the 3 Ds, this formula is called ARM. This is where you are going to show up for a productive debate with the person that you are engaging with, or in the case of social media, you're showing up for a productive debate with the person you might be engaging with on social media, not to pick a fight or not to prove who's right and who's wrong, but just to have an effective debate that shows that you are a human being speaking with another human being, and that you have no malintent. You are just here to have a productive discussion. So the A part of ARM is validating some portion of the person's argument. Now, if someone is saying Israel is an apartheid state, you're not going to agree with them and say, you're right, Israel is an apartheid state, but you're going to validate, you're going to show up for the conversation. That's the A. The A is showing up for the conversation. So if you see something on social media that says, Israel is clearly not interested in peace, you can see that with all of her political choices, or with whatever you might see on social media, you can show up to the argument and you can say, I'm interested in what news sources you are using in order to make this case. Let's continue that conversation, right? You are showing up to the argument. You are telling the person that I am here to have a dialogue with you. You're not shooting them down right away. And how could you say that? This is terrible. Something along those lines. That's going to immediately shut up the other person. It's a psychology thing, really. It's going to immediately shut up the other person and going to show them that you're not here to have a discussion. So you should always start with address. You should validate some portion of the person's argument if you can, or show up for the conversation. Now, the R is the most important part of this, of your conversation or in your engagement with the other person. The R is where you're going to be providing context. Now, usually when you see a claim about Israel, much like the ones that we saw originally, where it said legality, Israel's right to exist is not legal, or whatever Instagram example that we saw earlier, we are going to provide the context that's missing in that claim in order to help turn it around to our message. The message is what you end on. So the context, you don't want to turn into encyclopedia at this point, because then no one is going to really stay engaged and be listening to you. But at this point, you want to make sure that you are inserting 2, maybe 3 key facts that are going to help insert the context of what is missing in that claim in order to show that it's more complicated. It's not black and white. There's a lot of gray that's involved, especially in the Arab-Israeli conflict, or when it comes to different claims that we're hearing about Israel. And we want to insert it into the R. So the A is showing up to the conversation, showing the other person that you're here to have a dialogue. And the R is inserting the context that's missing while you are turning around the conversation into what you want to talk about. And what you want to talk about is the message. Your message should encourage further dialogue. It should be something peaceful. It should be something positive. It should be something universal. Always come back to your message. If you continue to have a dialogue, make sure that your message remains the same. But this is the thing that people are going to be taking away from your argument. I don't want to use the word argument, from your discussion, if you keep coming back to it. So again, address, show up to the conversation, show the person that you're here. If someone comes at you and says Israel is an apartheid state, a way to address that is to say, you know, I wonder where you might have heard that. Where did you hear that before? Then you're turning it around and you're asking them a question. That's a great way also to engage them and to show the person that you're showing up to the argument. Reframing. If you're specifically talking about the apartheid claim, you could insert context of the 1967 war. You could talk about the certain context of what is a Jewish settlement and what is a Palestinian settlement. Who is the PA? What are the Oslo Accords? What are different UN resolutions? Again, you don't want to put too much in there, because then you're going to turn it into an encyclopedia and people are going to tune out. But make sure to insert that context, and then make sure that at the end you lead to your message, and your message should be something of peace. I hope for a future where the Israelis and the Palestinians can live in peace together, not for our sake, but for their sake, for their children's sake, so that their children can live in a safe and peaceful environment where only positivity flourishes and coexistence, right? That's something that no one can really disagree with, and it's something that is going to stick with people to say, oh, wow, this person is coming from a place of humanity. And you have to truly mean it. You truly have to come from a place of humanity. When someone explains pain, you should be talking about pain. When someone, you should be feeling that pain. When someone talks about hurt, you should be feeling that hurt, so that your message really hits home, so that it really comes from a place of humanity. So that's the ARM technique that we use. Some extra fun tidbits that you can always insert in there is your message words, right? You'll notice that the message that I said is, I hope that in the future, Israeli children and Palestinian children can live in peace and prosperity and live together in coexistence, right? I'm using universal words because no one can really disagree with any of those words. And also because I am coming from a place of humanity, that is something that I truly, truly, truly want for the Israeli people and for the Palestinian people. It's a human issue. So make sure to use universal words in your message. That's number one. Number two is knowing your audience. There's a rule that we teach our students called the 10-80-10 rule. The number one rule of public speaking is you must always know your audience. You must always know who you're talking to and cater your message to that audience. You are going to have 10% of the population who is anti-Israel. They will always be anti-Israel, and they're not necessarily worth your time. There's an exception to that rule. There's 10% of the population who's pro-Israel. They will always be pro-Israel, and they're not really worth your time. There's also an exception to that rule. However, the 80% are the people in the middle. I like to call this potential friends of Israel. These are people who maybe don't know, they don't care, they're just trying to get to class, they're just trying to get to their next history class, they're just, whatever it is, they might not be interested, and your job is to show them that they can be interested, to connect Israel to them in a way that is interesting. And there's a way to connect Israel to anybody, as you know, because Israel is involved in so many universal causes, which is why Israel does have such a diverse network of support. It needs more support, of course, but this is why Israel has such a diverse network of support. Now, we're going to come back to the exceptions. The 10% who is anti-Israel. Why is it important to engage with them? You should engage with them if and only if you feel confident and comfortable that not only are you able to use ARM in a very effective way, especially when you're feeling like your blood is boiling and they're attacking you right and left with claims, right? And that can especially happen on social media when you have that one degree of separation of the computer or the phone between you and whomever you're engaging in. So you should feel confident in your ability to stay calm and collected, and that you have enough resources and information to be able to respond to the claims that they're going to say. It's important because you don't know who's watching you, right? In the case of social media, you have people who are reading the feed, and those are the people who are similar to if you are engaging with that person in real time. There might be a group of people who surround you if you're having a conversation, a dialogue with someone who might be anti-Israel. Now, I'm going to pose you guys a question that I'm not going to wait for an answer for because I know the answer is, if someone is yelling and screaming at you and you are staying calm and collected and answering all of their questions, and you're staying calm and you're showing up to the conversation, right? You're showing up to the conversation as a human being. Are the people who are surrounding you going to be listening to you, or are they going to be listening to whoever's screaming at you at all of these claims? The answer, of course, is that people are going to be listening to you because they're going to see you as the credible source of information. Same goes with online rhetoric. If you start yelling and screaming or using yelling and screaming while typing, using lots of caps, using lots of exclamation points, question marks, profanities, anything along those lines, people are immediately going to discredit you. So make sure that you are staying calm and collected so that you become the source of information instead of the person throwing the claims at you. It's important to show up to those conversations to hear what those people are saying, right? We're not going to know what to teach our students how to respond to difficult questions about Israel if we don't know what the other side is saying. So we need to learn what the other side is saying. We need to show up to those conversations so long as we feel comfortable. And also, again, it's a humanity issue. Do not engage in conversation because you see them as the other, because you see them as not human. Don't do that. Engage in conversation. They are human beings as well, so long as you feel comfortable defending yourself using arm and staying calm and collected. So that's the two exceptions to the 10% who's anti-Israel. The exception to the 10% who's pro-Israel is the reason why I'm here today. The pro-Israel students or community around the world doesn't necessarily know how to become the people who can engage with the anti-Israel or even with other people. They don't necessarily know how to make themselves a source of information. That's why Stand With Us goes out and teaches students all around the world so that they can be that resource, so that they can teach those students. We want people to become self-sufficient so that they can have those discussions. Something that people tell me a lot of the times is, why are you preaching to the choir? Why are you going to speak to yeshivas? Why are you going to speak to Jewish day school groups, to youth groups? They know, they don't, we're wasting our time. I used to be part of those people who would say, don't preach to the choir prior to my days at Stand With Us. And now I see what we need to be doing. The choir is singing off tune. It's very cacophonous at this point. We're all saying different things. Once we get all of the choir onto a gorgeous harmony, that's when we can stop preaching to the choir. But the choir doesn't know what they're singing. And that's why we need to be here today in order to engage high school students and college students to make sure that they have the resources. So that is the exception to the 10% of when you should be engaging with pro-Israel students. Now, the last two extra fun tidbits are analogies. Bring it home, bring it back to something that people can relate to. If you are talking to somebody about conflict in a far off place, in a far off land, they're not going to care, right? If I'm a New Yorker and someone is talking to me about a conflict in Kathmandu, yeah, I'm going to relate to it on a humanity issue, but at the end of the day, it's not really going to affect my life. But if someone is talking to me about an issue out in Kathmandu that was very, very similar to what happened in 9/11 here today, or not here today, 9/11, that affected my family in New York City, that's something that's going to sit much more deeply with me. It's going to touch me. It's going to resonate with me. So make sure that you are using analogies so that people don't necessarily see what you're talking about as an issue in a far off land that, okay, sure, it's important to you, but why does it matter to me? So that they really are able to relate to those issues as something that could have affected them or something similar to something that has affected them. And then the very last thing that I want to encourage you to do, much like what I did with the arm, with the A in the arm, where I asked the person where they heard the term apartheid or where that came from, is you're going to ask questions. Not only is that going to then take the defensive off of you and put it onto the person that you're speaking to, it's going to give you time to think so that you can start phrasing your R in your head before you get there. Again, this is assuming that you will have in-person interactions. If you're online, you're going to have much more time to develop your R because there isn't necessarily real-time correspondences between the people who are engaging in the dialogue. But it makes it more engaging and it makes it more of a discussion. So these are just extra fun tidbits that you guys can use when engaging in defending Israel on social media, specifically in the age of social distancing. So the very last thing I'm going to touch upon today, which is everybody's favorite part, is what can you do? What is out there for you to be able to engage in order to defend Israel when you're stuck at home and all you have is your Facebook newsfeed, your Instagram feed, your Snapchat, your TikTok, everything along those lines? What can you do in order to defend Israel using all of those platforms? I was joking with some of the moderators of today's call that as I was going through pulling content for this presentation earlier this week, I was just looking up different hashtags on Instagram, on Facebook, on Snapchat, looking for different accounts, and they had the exact content that I needed for this presentation, which means that that content was problematic. So you can report them, and I did. So if you find yourself with extra time to kill, and you know, you've read all of your books and you've watched all of your TV shows, or you've called all of your relatives, your grandparents to make sure that they're okay, start looking for anti-Israel stuff on different social media platforms, and then you can actually report those different that content on social media platforms. Now, of course, I would argue that you shouldn't do too much of it at a time, because then those platforms are going to recognize you as someone who might be sounding the alarm too often, and be very careful what you're reporting to make sure that it actually does fit into any one of those 3Ds, because you don't want to then be blocked yourself on social media. So make sure that you're doing it tastefully, but it is something that you can absolutely do, and you could spend all day reporting different content on social media. There's enough out there that definitely needs to be reported. So that's the first thing, the action item that you can definitely do. The second thing that you can do, and I'm going to pause the presentation here for a second, is you can go to a website called standwithusaction.com. This is a website that we pulled together different petitions based off of action items that we are calling on the Stand With Us supporters all around the world to help us with, different petitions that you can sign, and these actually have made a difference. Currently, we have different action items on the website. You can see those right here. You can participate in those action items. Some of them call for you to sign a petition. Others of them call for you to report something on social media, and you can see that it actually has made a difference. These are different success stories that we have taken part of and played a huge part of in order to get things changed. I'm sure you guys all heard about what happened with Airbnb. I believe that was a year ago, where Airbnb wanted to stop allowing hosts in the West Bank because it's a disputed territory. We started a petition that got over 8,000 signatures to sign a petition to Airbnb. That was part of the reason why they did change their policy with that regard. We also had a different petition that we sent to Nikki Haley with over 10,000 signatures. You might see yourself as only one person, but if each of those 10,000 people only saw themselves as one person, then we wouldn't be able to get all of those signatures. So you can definitely take part in all of these different action items on standwithusaction.com and share them on social media so that you can amplify your voice, right? Social media allows you to amplify your voice in a very real way if you engage with people in the right way. So that's the second way that you can be involved. We are going to go back to the presentation now. The next way that you can be involved is to like and share Stand With Us content on social media. Pick your poison. We have Facebook, we have Instagram, we have Twitter. Stand With Us is the largest creator, and we have the largest following of any Jewish pro-Israel group on social media. We in our peak weeks, we actually reach over 100 million people on Facebook, and that's in our peak weeks. So be part of that movement. Go ahead and share the information on any of those social media platforms. I remember back in the different wars against where Israel was engaging with Hamas in Gaza, in 2008, 2009, and 2014 earlier, I would be constantly sharing different news updates from different news sources, and of course from Stand With Us's website as well. And I received messages, text messages, and Facebook messages from some of my classmates from elementary school that I had not engaged with since elementary school, saying, thank you so much for posting all of this content. I would not be up on the news. I would not know what was going on if it wasn't for your incessant sharing. these are people that I really honestly forgot existed, and they saw me as a resource because I was constantly sharing. So if you are sharing good content, you will make yourself a resource of good information for your peers, or even not for your peers. But again, make sure that what you're sharing is good, make sure that it is resourceful, and make sure that it's not from fake news sites. Stand With Us, I can assure you, does not share fake news. So anything that you share from Stand With Us, I promise you, will be a good news source. Initiate dialogue. You can participate in dialogue with people when you see that Israel is being attacked, or when you see that Jews are being attacked on social media, especially now where we need to socially distance and we can't necessarily have those conversations in person. You can initiate dialogue in certain groups, but my caveat to that is to be careful not to get in unnecessary comment wars. I cannot tell you the amount of times that I have heard of people literally staying up all night having a comment war with anonymous person from the other side of the world. On the one hand, yes, you might influence the 80% who are going to be reading the comments as you're going down, but if it gets really out of hand and if it gets too long, people don't read anymore. So at a certain point in time, you can just tell that person, you know what, I'd love to take this offline. Feel free to message me independently. And then you can have those conversations one-on-one. But at a certain point, those very long comment wars do not become effective. People will stop reading them, I promise. And then the last thing I want to talk about is inspiration. Inspire people with your story to be proud of their Jewish identity, to be proud of their Zionism, to be proud of who they are as a person. And the most beautiful example, or not the most beautiful, but a very beautiful example of what you can do, or what has been done in the past, is this great campaign called Why I Wear My Star. Stand With Us, as you may or may not know, has a high school internship program where we choose juniors and seniors in high school who have already proven themselves to be leaders in their communities for Israel, and we train them to be the best Israel educators and best Israel activists that they can be in their current high school communities, building pro-Israel clubs and planning pro-Israel programs for their peers. But also the goal is to make sure that these are the students who are prepared to be the leaders for Israel on their future college campuses. Now, 2 of our high school interns this year, who are about to finish up their high school internship in June, they'll be done with their high school internship. Their names are Sammy and Abby. One of them is from South Florida, and one of them is from North Carolina. Both of them are very involved in BBYO and knew each other peripherally through BBYO, and they were both accepted into the Stand With Us high school internship program last year. And when they were both accepted, they kind of reconnected, and both of them had experienced pretty virulent anti-Semitism in their youth. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism is something that is creeping even into elementary school. One of our students had one of her friends, or someone who she thought was one of her friends, who started this program. One of the students, her friend was drawing on her arm just during class one day. They were bored, and she didn't really pay attention to what her friend was drawing on her arm. And when she looked over after her friend was finished drawing, she saw 3 swastikas on her arm, and this was someone that she considered to be a friend. So that's just one example of disgusting anti-Semitism that these students are facing today. So she, along with the other student, Abby, who are very involved in BBYO, and both were accepted into the Stand With Us high school internship program, decided to start a campaign called Why I Wear My Star. Now, they didn't really know what they were doing when they started. They just kind of they made an Instagram page. They each uploaded a picture of themselves wearing their Jewish star and why they're proud to wear their Jewish star. They wrote a quick, little paragraph tidbit of why they're proud to wear their Jewish star. They shared it with their friends in BBYO. They shared it with their friends at Stand With Us, and it started getting traction, and they started getting more and more followers, hundreds of more followers, and they started getting submissions from all around the world, people that they had no idea who they were, writing about why they are proud to wear their star. And now it's a movement that these girls are using in order to inspire people to be proud of their Jewish identity, in spite of the fact today that so many high school students are facing anti-Semitism, or at least seeing it around the world, or in their communities. To stand up to it and say, in spite of the fact that a university that I might be interested might have been defaced with anti-Israel or anti-Semitic rhetoric, in spite of the fact that there might have been an anti-Israel or anti-Semitic rally in my city, in spite of the fact that a synagogue was sprayed with swastikas, wherever, whatever anti-Semitic activity existed in your community, that is not going to shut me up, and that is going to make me proud. And so that's what these girls are doing with Why I Wear My Star, and it's a social media campaign that's very prominent and very popular today. We actually had both of the girls speak on one of our high school only webinars that we had at Stand With Us last night, where students shared their experiences with anti-Semitism. And so that's something that that you guys can participate in. So we are almost out of time, which is perfect because we are almost done with this presentation. The last thing I want to leave you with is that there is no such thing as a cookie cutter advocate. Everybody can use their strengths and to keep in mind their weaknesses in order to do what they are the most comfortable with. So you can do something, anything along the lines of, you can write a blog if you're a writer, report hate speech, right? What I talked about on social media, write an article, get in touch with Stand With Us, read the news, keep up to date with the news and become a resource of information. You can comment on a post, sign a petition, submit something to Why I Wear My Star. You can share a post on social media. You can participate in the Stand With Us Teen Leadership Council program, which is a semester-long program for high school students who want to get more involved in Israel education. You can have a conversation, attend a webinar. As I mentioned, Stand With Us has webinars there every Tuesday and Thursday at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern for high school students only, and different topics that relate to something that might be interesting to them. So that's something that you can definitely get, or not you, but you or your students can get involved in. Read a book, share your pride in Israel. That's just some examples of some of the things that you can get involved in. I want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to attend this webinar. Here's how you can get in touch with me and with Stand With Us for our specific high school programming. You can also just get in touch with me if you're interested in non-high school specific programming. And during COVID, Stand With Us is hosting specific programming that you can take advantage of even during social distancing. And you can find all of that at standwithus.com/connect. So these are all the different ways that you can get in touch with us. I want to thank you all and open it up for any questions.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. If you have any other questions, you can always reach out to us at Jewish Federation. And thank you, Mary, that was really great. Hope everyone's keeping safe, doing well, and we hope to see you guys soon. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.